A poor student married a 72-year-old wealthy woman. 1 week later, he was shocked to realize this. A gray sky loomed over the small college town of Ridgewood, its streets slick with rain. Jake Carter trudged along the sidewalk, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face etched with worry. At 23, he was juggling his final year of law school, a part-time job, and an avalanche of debts left by his late father. The world seemed to close in tighter every day. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Jake Carter speaking," he answered. A composed, authoritative voice responded. "Mr. Carter, this is Veronica Hayes. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." Jake frowned. "I'm sorry, who are you? How do you know about?" "I know enough," she interrupted smoothly. "Meet me at Hayes Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended before Jake could protest. Confused but intrigued, he made his way to the upscale cafe. The rain fell harder as he arrived, his jacket doing little to keep him dry. Stepping inside, he was greeted by warm lighting and the aroma of fresh coffee. At a corner table sat Veronica Hayes, a striking woman with silver hair styled impeccably, dressed in a tailored suit that radiated wealth. "Jake," she greeted, gesturing for him to sit, her tone calm yet commanding. Jake hesitated before taking the seat opposite her. "Ms. Hayes, what's this about?" "Straight to the point." "Good," she said, sipping her tea. "Jake, I know about your debts, the ones your father left behind. I know you're barely scraping by. I'm here to offer a solution." Jake's brows furrowed. "And what would that be?" She set down her cup, her piercing blue eyes meeting his. "Marry me." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Jake blinked, sure he'd misheard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't about romance. It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts, ensure your financial security, and in return, you'll be my husband." Jake let out a disbelieving laugh. "You're serious? Why me? You don't even know me." Veronica leaned forward slightly. "Exactly. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love, Jake. I need a companion, someone to share my name, my estate, and nothing more. Think of it as a contract." Jake shook his head, his mind racing. "This is insane. What's in it for you?" Her expression softened for the first time. "I've spent my life alone, Jake. I have no children, no family left. I want companionship, even if it's just for appearances. And I want control of my legacy. A husband will help solidify that." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. "I can't. I need time to think." "Of course," she replied coolly. "But don't take too long. The offer doesn't stand forever." Jake walked home in a daze, the rain soaking through his clothes. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his mother, her pale face etched with worry. The cost of her treatments had drained them both, and his younger sister's tuition loomed like a dark cloud. "Jake," his mother said softly after he explained Veronica's proposition. "I know it sounds unthinkable, but if she's willing to help, maybe it's worth considering." Jake stared at his hands, torn between his pride and his desperation. "You're asking me to marry a woman I don't love just to solve our problems? I'm asking you to save yourself," she said, her voice trembling. "To save us." The following morning, Jake returned to the bistro. Veronica was already there, her demeanor as calm and composed as before. "You've decided?" she asked, not looking up from her tablet. Jake took a deep breath. "I'll do it." She smiled faintly, setting down her tablet. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." A week later, Jake stood in a small courthouse, dressed in a suit Veronica had provided. The ceremony was quiet, witnessed only by Veronica's lawyer and a notary. As they exchanged vows, Jake couldn't shake the unease in his chest. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Veronica turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Carter." As they left the courthouse, rain drizzling once more, Jake looked at his reflection in a puddle and wondered, have I just saved my family, or sold my soul? The gates to Veronica Hayes' estate creaked open as Jake's cab rolled up the long driveway. The house loomed ahead, a sprawling mansion that could easily pass for a museum. Its towering columns and pristine stone facade exuded old money, but its windows seemed dark and lifeless. Jake stepped out, suitcase in hand, feeling like a visitor in someone else's dream, or perhaps nightmare. Veronica greeted him in the foyer, her demeanor as polished as ever. "Welcome, Mr. Carter," she said, the formal address sending a shiver down Jake's spine. "I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction. Dinner is at 7. He nodded mutely, following a housekeeper who led him to his room. It was opulent, with a king-size bed, antique furnishings, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens. Despite its luxury, the room felt cold, as if untouched by human warmth. That evening, Jake sat stiffly at the long dining table. Veronica was at the other end, dressed impeccably in a silk blouse and pearls. The food was extravagant, prepared by a chef he hadn't seen yet, served by staff who moved silently. "I trust you're settling in?" Veronica asked, cutting into her filet mignon with surgical precision. "It's different," Jake replied cautiously. "This place is huge. Feels like I'll get lost." Veronica smirked. "You'll get used to it, or you won't. Either way, you're here." Jake bristled at her bluntness. "You didn't mention much about your late husband before." Veronica's knife paused mid-cut. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin before speaking. "He was a businessman, like your father. Their paths crossed once or twice." Her tone darkened. "But as you might imagine, not all encounters end well." Jake's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her eyes sharp. "Let's just say unfinished business has a way of lingering." She picked up her glass of wine. "But that's in the past. You'll soon understand why I chose you." Her cryptic words left Jake uneasy. After dinner, he wandered the halls of the estate. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint creak of floorboards underfoot. He passed several locked doors, their brass handles gleaming in the dim light. Each one seemed to whisper secrets he wasn't meant to know. As the days passed, Jake grew more unsettled. The staff avoided eye contact, speaking in hushed tones when they thought he wasn't listening. He overheard snippets of conversations that made his stomach twist. Why him? Does he even know? She never does anything without a reason. He'll figure it out eventually. They always do. One evening, while pacing the library, Jake noticed Veronica's desk. Papers were strewn across its surface, along with a small ornate key. It gleamed under the desk lamp, its intricate design catching his eye. His gaze darted around the room. No one was there. Heart pounding, he reached for it. The key was heavier than he expected, cool to the touch. Jake's mind raced. Could this be for one of the locked doors? He glanced toward the hallway, where shadows danced against the walls. His breath quickened as he slipped the key into his pocket. That night, lying in his luxurious but suffocating room, Jake turned the key over in his hands. A million questions swirled in his mind. But one loomed above all. What is Veronica hiding, and why had she really chosen me? The mansion was shrouded in stillness when Jake crept down the hall. The key felt like a lead weight in his pocket, its cool surface pressing against his thigh. His pulse quickened as he approached the door he had noticed earlier, its ornate handle gleaming faintly in the moonlight streaming through the windows. Glancing over his shoulder, Jake turned the key in the lock. The soft click reverberated in the silence, sending a chill down his spine. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The room was a time capsule, frozen in another era. Dusty furniture and faded wallpaper surrounded him. Photographs in tarnished silver frames lined a table, their images capturing happier times. Veronica as a young woman, a man who must have been her late husband, and another couple Jake didn't recognize. But it was the stack of papers on the desk that caught his attention. Jake flipped through them, his eyes widening. Legal documents detailed failed business deals between Veronica's late husband and Jake's father. A particular letter, written in sharp, slanted handwriting, accused Jake's father of fraud. "You ruined everything. My family was left with nothing because of your lies." His breath hitched when he noticed the last page, a marriage license. His name and Veronica's stared back at him, stark against the paper. It was dated weeks before the wedding, far earlier than he'd known. On the desk lay an old, leather-bound diary. Jake hesitated, then opened it. The entries were Veronica's, revealing a calculated plan to trap Jake in a marriage that would fulfill her ultimate goal, to settle old scores. "I will take everything from him, just as his father did to me. He will be my pawn." Jake froze as the door creaked behind him. "Enjoying yourself?" Veronica's voice was icy, cutting through the shadows like a blade. He spun around, guilt and fear written across his face. "Veronica, you thought you'd find answers here?" She stepped into the room, her silhouette sharp against the dim light from the hall. "Curiosity killed the cat, Jake. What do you think you're doing?" His voice was low but firm. "Why did you really marry me? Is this about my father? Is this some kind of revenge?" Veronica's eyes hardened, her usual composed facade cracking. "It's not your place to ask questions, Jake. Just do what you're told, and you'll leave this marriage better off than you started. Isn't that enough for you?" Jake's fists clenched. "Enough? You've lied to me, manipulated me. This isn't a marriage, it's a trap." Veronica's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "A trap, is it? Maybe you should have thought twice before signing those papers." She stepped closer, her tone venomous. "You may think you're smart, Jake, but you're just like your father, blind to the damage you cause until it's too late." Jake glared at her, the weight of his father's legacy crushing him anew. "If you hated him so much, why take it out on me? I had nothing to do with what he did to your family." Veronica stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching like a taut string. Finally, she turned on her heel. "You're in over your head, Jake. Stay out of matters that don't concern you." With that, she left the room, her footsteps fading down the hall. Later that night, Jake lay wide awake in bed, his mind racing. Veronica's words haunted him, but so did the documents and diary. Why had she gone to such lengths to entangle him in her schemes? Was it really just about revenge? His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of Veronica's voice. He slipped out of bed and crept toward her study, pressing his ear against the door. "Make sure the transfer is complete," Veronica said, her tone sharp and commanding. "We can't let him back out now. Time is running out." Jake's blood ran cold. Whatever was happening, he was in deeper than he'd ever imagined. The next morning, Jake approached Mr. Wallace, the estate's head butler, a man whose calm demeanor suggested he had seen and heard more than he let on. "Mr. Wallace, I need your help," Jake said, his voice low. "Something isn't right here." The older man regarded him with a steady gaze, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Wallace," he began again, "you know something, don't you? About Veronica, about all of this." Mr. Wallace hesitated before speaking. "You're not the first young man to be drawn into Mrs. Brooks's world, Mr. Carter. She's clever, resourceful, and ruthless when it comes to her goals. My advice? Watch your back." Jake's chest tightened. "Why are you still here if you know what she's capable of?" The butler's expression softened, a flicker of regret passing across his face. "Some of us don't have the luxury of walking away." Determined to find a way out, Jake began devising a plan. He reached out to a trusted friend from law school, Andy, under the guise of catching up. Andy? Jake asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Hypothetically, if someone signed a contract under coercion or false pretenses, is there any way to void it? Andy frowned. Hypothetically, yes, but it depends on the evidence. Why? Are you in some kind of trouble? Jake deflected. Just a class project I'm working on. Thanks, man. The next few days, Jake carefully searched Veronica's office whenever she was away, hoping to uncover something that could explain her obsession with his father. Late one night, as he rifled through her desk, he found an envelope addressed to his father. The letter inside was a scathing condemnation, written by Veronica herself. It accused Jake's father of embezzlement, fraud, and deceit that had led to the financial ruin of Veronica's family and the death of her husband. You left us with nothing. My husband's heart couldn't take the stress, and he's gone because of you. I will see to it that your family pays for what you've done. Jake's stomach churned. Veronica's actions weren't just about reclaiming her fortune. They were about revenge, fueled by years of pain and anger. Returning the letter to its hiding place, Jake resolved to act. He couldn't allow Veronica to use him as a tool for her vendetta. That night, he began mapping out possible escape routes from the estate. But Veronica's sharp instincts caught wind of his unease. The next morning, she found him in the breakfast room. Her icy presence cut through the quiet like a blade. You've been busy, haven't you? Veronica said, her tone calm but laced with menace. Jake froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. I don't know what you're talking about. Veronica smiled coldly. Don't play coy with me, Jake. If you think you can outsmart me, you're sorely mistaken. I've dealt with far craftier opponents than you. Jake swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. I don't know what you're accusing me of, but I'm not doing anything wrong. Veronica leaned closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. If you betray me, you'll wish you hadn't. Remember that. She straightened and left the room, leaving Jake to grapple with the growing realization that escape might be more dangerous than staying. But staying meant surrendering his life to Veronica's twisted plans, a fate he refused to accept. That night, Jake paced the grand library, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily on his shoulders. The investigator he'd quietly hired had left, confirming the devastating truth. Veronica's late husband, Harold Brooks, had been swindled by Jake's father in a fraudulent real estate deal. The scheme had wiped out the Brooks family fortune and pushed Harold to his death from a heart attack. Veronica's proposal to marry Jake had been a calculated move to settle scores and humiliate the Carter name, even from beyond the grave. Jake clenched his fists, anger and guilt swirling inside him. He had never been close to his father, but the consequences of the man's actions were now Jake's burden to bear. Veronica's marriage proposition wasn't just a ploy for control, it was vengeance in its cruelest form. Determined to confront her, Jake waited until dinner. As usual, Veronica was seated at the head of the table, elegantly dressed, a glass of red wine in hand. The tension between them crackled in the air as Jake sat down. Enjoying your new life? She asked, her voice cool and measured. Jake didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on her. Finally, he said, I know what you're doing. Veronica raised an eyebrow, pretending to be amused. Oh? Enlighten me. You married me to get back at my father, Jake said, his voice steady despite the fury building inside him. This isn't about companionship or legacy, it's revenge. Her expression didn't waver, but her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. What a bold accusation, Jake. Do you have proof? Your diary, he shot back, his tone sharp. The letters. The investigator. I know everything, Veronica. A tense silence filled the room. Veronica finally set her glass down, leaning back in her chair. Fine, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. You're right. I married you because your family destroyed mine. Your father was a thief, a liar, and a coward. And now, you'll pay the price for his sins. Jake's jaw clenched. I didn't ask for any of this. I'm not him. But you carry his name, she said coldly. And that's enough. Jake stood, his chair scraping against the floor. You're no better than he was, Veronica. You've spent your life consumed by hatred, and now you're dragging me into it. Well, I'm done. Veronica smirked, her calm facade returning. Done? Do you really think you can just walk away? Look around, Jake. You're in my world now, and there's no escape. Her words hung in the air as Jake stormed out of the dining room, his heart pounding. He couldn't let her win, not like this. Jake spent the next few days gathering evidence, documenting every detail of Veronica's schemes. He carefully photographed the letters, copied pages from her diary, and recorded conversations with the staff who hinted at knowing more than they let on. He even reached out to his law school friend, Andy, for advice on how to nullify the marriage contract. One night, as Jake prepared to leave the estate with his findings, Veronica confronted him in the foyer. Going somewhere? She asked, her voice icy. Jake didn't flinch. You can't keep me here forever, Veronica. She stepped closer, her heels echoing on the marble floor. You're right. I don't need to. Because no one will believe you. You're just a desperate, indebted law student. And I'm Veronica Brooks, a woman with power, connections, and resources you can't begin to comprehend. Jake met her gaze, determination burning in his eyes. You underestimate me, Veronica. That's your mistake. Without another word, he pushed past her and walked out the door, clutching the evidence that could finally set him free. Jake knew he couldn't face Veronica head-on without solid legal backing. The stakes were too high, and her influence could crush him if he made a single misstep. With the evidence he had gathered, he met with his friend Andy at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Andy flipped through the copies of letters and photographs, his brow furrowed. Jake, this is enough to make any judge take a second look at your situation. But you'll need more. Witnesses, financial records, anything that shows she coerced you into this marriage under false pretenses. Jake sighed. The staff at her estate knows more than they let on, but they're terrified of her. Andy leaned forward. Then you have to find the one person who's willing to talk. Even a small crack in her armor could bring her down. Back at the estate, Jake began his quiet campaign. He started with Mr. Harris, the estate's head butler, whose cryptic remarks suggested he knew too much to stay silent forever. Jake approached him late one evening in the staff quarters, away from prying eyes. Mr. Harris, Jake said, his voice low. I need your help. You've been here long enough to know what Veronica is capable of. I can't fight her alone. The older man sighed, his expression a mix of resignation and pity. You're braver than the others who've tried to stand up to her. But bravery won't protect you from her wrath. Jake stepped closer. Then help me. If she's destroyed others before, you owe it to them to expose the truth. After a long pause, Mr. Harris nodded. There's a storage room in the West Wing. She keeps old ledgers there, records of everything she's done. If you can get those, you'll have your proof. That night, Jake made his move. He waited until the mansion was dark and silent, then slipped into the West Wing. The storage room was tucked behind a hidden panel in the wall, just as Mr. Harris had described. Using the ornate key he had taken earlier, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was filled with boxes of documents, but Jake's eyes immediately went to a ledger labeled Private Accounts. He flipped through the pages, finding detailed records of transactions and notes that tied Veronica directly to fraudulent schemes and manipulations. Suddenly, the lights flicked on. Looking for something? Jake froze. Veronica stood in the doorway, her expression cold and dangerous. You just can't help yourself. Can you? She said, stepping closer. Jake straightened, clutching the ledger. This ends now, Veronica. I have everything I need to expose you. She smirked. And who's going to believe you? A struggling law student against me? I'll bury you in legal battles before you even make it to court. Jake held up his phone, which had been recording their exchange. Maybe. But this recording and these documents are already backed up and sent to my lawyer. So go ahead, try me. For the first time, Veronica's confidence wavered. She glared at Jake, her calm facade cracking. You've made a mistake, Jake. You don't know the enemies you're making. Jake stepped past her, the ledger in hand. And you don't know the strength of someone who has nothing left to lose. Jake wasted no time. The moment he left the mansion, he called Andy and sent him all the evidence, including the recorded conversation. This is solid, Andy said after reviewing the files. But Veronica will retaliate. We need to move fast. Andy helped Jake draft a legal petition to nullify the marriage on the grounds of coercion, fraud, and emotional distress. They also filed for a temporary restraining order against Veronica, knowing her influence could make her dangerous. The next morning, Veronica made her first move. Jake woke to find reporters outside his tiny apartment. As he turned on the news, his stomach dropped. Local law student embroiled in scandal, the anchor announced. Veronica Brooks, a prominent businesswoman, alleges her young husband attempted to blackmail her for money, citing fabricated evidence. Jake's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, many from reporters demanding a statement. He called Andy in a panic. She's flipped the narrative. Everyone thinks I'm the villain. Andy's voice was steady. Let her play her hand, Jake. We have the evidence. Public sympathy might be against you now, but the court will see the truth. Lay low and let me handle the legal side. Despite Andy's reassurances, Jake couldn't shake the anxiety. He knew Veronica wasn't finished. That evening, Mr. Harris showed up at Jake's apartment unannounced. She's losing her grip, the butler said, his face grave. But she's desperate, Jake. You need to be careful. I overheard her on the phone. She's trying to use her connections to discredit you further. Jake nodded. Thanks, Mr. Harris. I'll be ready. The butler handed him a small envelope. This might help your case. It's a letter Harold wrote before he died. He blamed your father but also expressed regret about the whole ordeal. It shows he never wanted things to escalate the way they did. Jake's chest tightened as he read the letter. It painted a more nuanced picture of the feud between their families and proved Veronica's vendetta wasn't entirely justified. The court hearing came faster than Jake had anticipated. The courtroom was packed, Veronica's presence commanding as she sat with her high-profile lawyer. Jake felt like an ant under a magnifying glass, but Andy stood firm beside him. Veronica's lawyer opened with a scathing argument, painting Jake as a gold digger who had betrayed a kind-hearted widow. But when it was Jake's turn, Andy systematically dismantled their claims. Your Honor, Andy said, presenting the evidence, this marriage was a calculated act of coercion. My client was manipulated into a legal arrangement under false pretenses, as these letters and recordings clearly show. The courtroom buzzed as Andy played the recording of Veronica admitting her motives. Her calm, venomous tone was undeniable. Veronica's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him. I've heard enough. The judge turned to Veronica. Mrs. Brooks, this evidence is damning. It's clear you used deceit to force Mr. Carter into this marriage. The court will annul the marriage immediately. Furthermore, we will be investigating your financial dealings for potential fraud. Jake exhaled in relief as the gavel struck. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Jake, but this time, the narrative had shifted. How do you feel now that the truth is out? One asked. Jake paused, then said, relieved. I didn't want to be part of this fight, but I wasn't going to let her destroy my life. This was never about revenge. It was about doing what's right. As he walked away, his phone buzzed. It was Andy. You did it, Jake, Andy said. She's finished. Jake glanced up at the sky, the clouds finally parting. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. The investigation into Veronica's financial dealings moved swiftly. With Jake's evidence and the additional documents retrieved from the estate, prosecutors uncovered a web of fraud, embezzlement, and manipulation that spanned decades. Veronica's empire, once a symbol of power and prestige, began to crumble. Her business associates distanced themselves, some even turning over incriminating evidence to save their own reputations. The media, initially sympathetic to her, shifted their focus to her wrongdoings, exposing her as a cunning manipulator who thrived on exploiting others. Veronica was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud and coercion. Her assets were frozen, her estate seized, and her name tarnished beyond repair. The once mighty businesswoman now faced a future behind bars. With the annulment finalized and Veronica's grip on his life gone, Jake finally felt free. The funds she had used to control him were redirected by the court to pay off the debts she had inherited from her feud with his father, leaving Jake with a clean slate. He returned to law school with renewed determination, pouring his energy into his studies and using his experience to fuel his passion for justice. His professors, impressed by his resilience, helped him secure a prestigious internship at a prominent law firm. Andy remained a steadfast friend, offering advice and encouragement as Jake rebuilt his life. One afternoon, Jake sat in a small cafe, reflecting on the chaos of the past year. A woman approached him hesitantly. "Jake Carter?" she asked. He nodded. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "I used to work for Veronica. What you did, it gave so many of us the courage to move on. You exposed the truth." Jake smiled. "It wasn't easy, but sometimes doing the right thing isn't." Months later, Jake stood in the courtroom, this time as an intern assisting on a high-profile case. As he reviewed the files, he felt a deep sense of purpose. His journey had been tumultuous, but it had shaped him into someone stronger, someone who could face adversity and fight for what was right. And as he walked out of the courthouse that day, the sun shining brightly, Jake realized that his future was his own, and it was just beginning.